Here's something I find genuinely funny, and it's where I want to start tonight. Nobody actually knows who the stormtrooper is. You know the one I mean. Death Star, control room, walks straight into the top of the doorframe. It's arguably the most famous mistake in the history of cinema, and to this day, 2 different men have both claimed it was them, and one of them died in 2016 without the matter ever being properly settled. That's the kind of thing we're doing for the next couple of hours. 100 of them. Crew members who wandered into shot, jackets that vanish between cuts, lines of dialogue that don't match the mouths saying them, bits of lore that flatly contradict other bits of lore made decades earlier or decades later. There's no ranking here, no countdown, no big one saved for the end. I've grouped them roughly by film, so it's easy to follow along, and you can drop off at any point without missing anything. If you're new here, the subscribe button's in the usual place. Right, Tatooine. I want to do this one in order, start to finish, because the 1977 film is where most people's mental list already lives, and it's nice to have the shape of the thing before we start jumping around. So, the Tantive I-4 is boarded, Leia gets her message into R2, and the droids land on Tatooine. Fine so far, except a few minutes earlier, when the escape pod is jettisoned and the Star Destroyer's gunners spot it, one of them says, "There goes another one." Another one. Which is such a small thing, but it implies this is a regular Tuesday for them. Pods flying off all over the shop. Nobody's checking. I love it, honestly, because it makes the entire Empire sound like a company with a very relaxed attitude to inventory. And it's the reason the pod gets waved through. No life forms aboard. Don't bother. The single most important cargo delivery in galactic history gets past the Imperial Navy because a bloke on a gun turret couldn't be bothered. Now, once we're at the Lars homestead, there's a lovely one that I only noticed embarrassingly late in life. Luke is cleaning R2 in the garage. R2 plays back a fragment of the message. Luke jumps back in surprise. Watch C-3PO in the background instead of Luke. Anthony Daniels loses his footing on the step and slips, and then recovers so smoothly that the shot stays usable. He was in an enormously uncomfortable, rigid costume with limited visibility, and he saved the take in real time. That's not really a mistake so much as a bit of quiet professionalism accidentally preserved on film, but it's in every version of the movie, so it counts. Then we get to Obi-Wan's hut, which is where things start getting properly sloppy. Luke and Obi-Wan are talking about Anakin, the Force, the lightsaber, all the foundational stuff. Luke's jacket is hanging on the wall behind them, clearly visible. Cut. Jacket's gone. Nobody's moved. No time has passed. It's just not there anymore. Someone on the crew presumably needed to shift it for a lighting reason, and then forgot to put it back. And now, it's permanently part of one of the most re-watched scenes in film history. Speaking of that scene, this is also where Obi-Wan tells Luke about the blast points on the Jawa sandcrawler. Too accurate for sand people, he says. Only Imperial stormtroopers are that precise, which was perfectly fine as a line for 22 years. Then the prequels arrived and showed us Tusken Raiders, who are, frankly, excellent shots. They hit a moving pod racer. This is the recurring problem with prequels generally, and Star Wars has it worse than most. A throwaway line becomes wrong retroactively, decades later, because someone made a film set earlier. Nobody did anything wrong. The line just quietly stopped being true. There's a related one right at the homestead, and it's a plot thing rather than a visual thing. Uncle Owen tells Luke his father was a navigator on a spice freighter, nothing to see here, and Luke immediately asks whether Obi-Wan knew his father, which, if you think about it, is a strange leap. Owen has just told him his father was a navigator on a spice freighter. Why would Luke assume they knew each other? The scene needs Luke to ask, so Luke asks. And on the subject of Vader's chest bothering nobody, on the subject of things nobody questions, I want to talk about Leia's accent. In her first scene with Vader aboard the Tantive I-4, Carrie Fisher is doing a sort of clipped mid-Atlantic thing. It comes and goes. By Yavin, she's American again. This one gets listed as a mistake all over the place, and I want to be a bit fair about it. It isn't really a continuity error, so much as a very young actor finding a character in the middle of an enormous production. It's commonly cited though, so I'm mentioning it. I don't think it's a flaw. I think it's just visible. Right, Death Star. The big one. The one everybody knows. R2 and C-3PO are in the control room overlooking Docking Bay 327. The door opens, stormtroopers pile in, and one of them, a tall extra who did not account for the clearance, smacks his head straight into the top of the frame and visibly recoils. Here's what makes it perfect though. In the 1997 special edition, George Lucas didn't remove it. He added a sound effect, a little comedy donk. He looked at the most famous mistake in his own film and decided the correct move was to make it louder. I think about that a lot. We'll come back to it much later, because the studio's attitude to its own errors changes quite dramatically over the following 40 years, and it changes in a direction you might not expect. As for who it was, Laurie Good has said it was him. He was 31 at the time, drafted in at the last minute to replace another actor who'd called in sick. He kept quiet about it for years because when he first mentioned it at a convention, the organiser shrugged and said, "Everyone claims that." Michael Leader also claimed it, and at least one obituary named him as the Stormtrooper. So there's no resolution. 2 men, 1 doorframe, and a franchise that has never officially picked a side. Still on the Death Star. Luke and Han knock out 2 stormtroopers and steal their armour, which fits them suspiciously well given that Luke is a farm boy and Han is a foot taller. Fine. Cartoon logic, I'll allow it. What I won't allow is the trash compactor. They go into that compactor in stormtrooper armour. They come out, walk through several corridors, and by the time they're back at the Falcon, they're in their own clothes again. Own belts, own boots, own weapons. Where did they get them? They left them on the ship. The ship is the place they're trying to get to. And while we're in that room, Luke goes completely under the water. Fully submerged, dragged down by the Dianoga, the whole thing. He surfaces, they get out, and within a few minutes, his hair is dry and reasonably tidy. I'm not asking for much here. I've been caught in light drizzle and looked worse than that for an hour. 2 more before we leave. The first is Captain Antilles. Vader lifts him by the throat at the very start of the film, crushes his windpipe and throws him against the wall. And there's movement in the body as it goes that a dead man shouldn't have. It's very quick and very easy to miss, and I'd let it go entirely, except that Empire does the exact same thing with a different character, so it becomes a pattern rather than a one-off. We'll get to that one. The second is the tracking device. The whole point of letting the Falcon escape is that the Empire has tagged the ship and wants it followed to the Rebel base. Tarkin says so explicitly, and yet on the way out, TIE fighters attack the Falcon with what looks like real intent to destroy it. Han and Luke shoot down 4 of them. If the plan is to follow the ship, the plan is very badly communicated to the pilots doing the shooting. The standard defense is that the attack has to look convincing, or the rebels would smell a trap, which is a good defense. It just doesn't quite explain why the Falcon takes actual damage. And finally, the trench run. During the attack, Red Leader refers to Gold 5 as Gold Leader. Wrong call sign, right squadron. Except, and I like this one, there's an argument that it's deliberate. Gold Squadron has just lost 2 pilots, one of whom was the actual Gold Leader. So Gold 5 would now be the acting Gold Leader, and Red Leader addressing him that way is correct military procedure, rather than a script error. I genuinely don't know which it is. I lean towards mistake, because that's a very sophisticated bit of radio protocol to bury in a film with a talking bin, but I'd be delighted to be wrong. A couple more from this film that I couldn't find a tidy home for. The hologram table in Obi-Wan's hut. When Luke and Obi-Wan are watching Leia's message projected onto that little low table, the objects sitting on it change position and change number between shots. Bits move, bits appear, bits go away. It's the sort of thing that happens on a small set where people keep having to reach in and adjust a prop between takes, and nobody was keeping a photograph of the arrangement. And the dice, the first proper interior shot of the Falcon cockpit, has a small pair of dice hanging above the viewport. They then disappear for essentially the rest of the trilogy, until they turn up again decades later, carrying enormous emotional weight in The Last Jedi and Solo. So the dice went from a bit of set dressing somebody hung up in 1976 to invisible to a plot device, which is a career. I want to add one broader thing about this film before I move on, because it explains a lot of the entries in this section. A New Hope was made by people who did not think it was going to work. That's not me being unkind, that's the documented mood on set. It was over budget, over schedule, shot partly in a Tunisian desert where the equipment kept failing, and a fair number of the crew thought they were making an expensive children's film that would come and go. Nobody was treating a background stormtrooper's entrance as something that would be examined frame by frame for the next 50 years. Which is why so many of these are small physical accidents rather than logical failures. A jacket moved, a step slipped on, a door frame misjudged. That changes completely once we get into the prequels, where the errors become much more about lore and much less about furniture. Different problems, different eras, different kinds of pressure. 16 down, then. And a note before we move on, because it affects everything that follows. There is no single version of this film. There's the 1977 theatrical cut, the 1981 print, the 1997 special edition, the 2004 DVD, the 2011 Blu-ray, and the 4K release, and they don't agree with each other. Things get fixed, things get added. Things that were never wrong get changed anyway. So when I say a mistake is in the film, what I really mean is that it's in some films and not others, and which one you own depends largely on when you bought it, which is a strange way to run a list, but there we go. Hoth next. I'm going to do this one by location rather than in order, because Empire's mistakes cluster very neatly into 3 piles. Everything on Hoth, everything in the asteroid field, and everything on Cloud City. And the Hoth pile is enormous. We open with Luke on his Tauntaun, scanning the horizon, and he says something to the effect of, "Hey, what's the matter? You smell something." And reflected in his goggles, big and fuzzy, is the boom microphone. Big fuzzy thing hanging above his head. It's right there in the first proper scene of the film. Then the Wampa attacks, and this is where it gets great. The Wampa's arm swings into frame and takes out the Tauntaun. In the letterboxed versions, and this is important, because in the cropped television versions you can't see it at all, the bottom left of the frame shows the open end of the glove. Not a creature's arm, a glove with a person's actual arm inside it, and the top of that person's head visible below. A crew member is lying just off camera with his hand up a puppet, and the frame is a few inches too wide. Then Luke gets dragged off, and there's a moment where you can see the real arm of the operator again, twice in about 10 seconds. Luke wakes up hanging upside down in the cave, and this is a proper old-fashioned continuity mess. In the wide shots, his legs are apart. In the close-ups, they're together. Back to wide, apart again. It goes back and forth. That happens when close-ups get picked up on a different day, on a different bit of set, and nobody photographs the original setup properly. While he's hanging there, his lightsaber is stuck hilt down in the snow, just out of reach. And on the visible end of that hilt, if the picture is clean enough, you can read the words, New York. That's a manufacturer's stamp. It's a real object made on Earth in a shop, and it went in front of the camera with the branding facing the lens. I find that far funnier than I should. Somewhere in the galaxy, far, far away, there is apparently a New York, and it makes laser swords. He gets the saber, cuts the Wampa's arm off, and staggers out into the snow. 2 things here. 1, The severed arm on the ground is cut off around the forearm, hand and elbow, but when you see the wampa afterwards, it's missing the whole limb from the shoulder. Somewhere between shots, another chunk of arm went missing entirely. 2. As Luke walks out, you hear the lightsaber power down. The distinctive descending hum. But the blade is still fully lit. The sound and the picture are just doing different things. Later, back at Echo Base, the injuries on Luke's face aren't consistent. The amount of blood changes between shots, the swelling shifts, the cuts don't quite match. This is worth knowing the background on. Actually, because it's a fun detail, the wampa sequence exists partly because Mark Hamill had a serious car accident between films, and his face had changed. The story needed to account for it. So the creature attack that generates all these continuity errors was partly a solution to a continuity problem, which is a nice little loop, Last Hoth one, and it's the sort of thing only somebody who's watched the film far too many times would flag. During the battle, Luke tells Wedge to hold steady and calls him Rogue 2. Wedge is Rogue 3. And we know the film knows this because a few minutes later, Luke correctly calls Zev, who is Rogue 2, Rogue 2. So it's not a systemic misunderstanding, it's just one line that went out wrong and nobody caught it. This one requires the widescreen version, same as the Wampa glove. Han, Leia and Chewie leave the Falcon to have a look at the cave they've parked in. As they walk left across the frame, you can see the edge of the tarpaulin they're standing on, the sheet laid down to protect the studio floor, and the faint outline of a crew member trying to scramble out of shot before the camera catches him. He doesn't quite make it. The other asteroid field entry is one of my favourites in the whole saga, and it's a performance thing rather than a technical one. When the Falcon gets thrown about and Han catches Leia, watch Harrison Ford's mouth while Carrie Fisher is delivering her line. He's mouthing along with her. Not obviously, not theatrically, just very slightly. That's what happens when you've done a scene enough times that the other person's dialogue has moved into your own head. Right, and then there's the Needa thing, which properly delights me. Captain Needa loses the Falcon, goes to apologise to Vader in person, and gets force-choked to death for his trouble. 2 officers come in to remove the body, and Michael Culver, playing Needa, quite visibly stands up to help them. He's supposed to be dead weight. Instead, he does a little assisting step to get himself into a better position for being carried. It's exactly the same failure mode as Captain Antilles at the start of the previous film, which suggests that in the late 70s nobody had really worked out how to make a corpse be a corpse on a tight schedule. On Cloud City itself, C-3PO gets blasted apart and Chewbacca collects the pieces. There's a close-up of 3PO's head travelling down a conveyor belt in the Ugnaught junk room, and reflected in that gold plating you can see the camera and several members of the crew standing around it. This happens more than once with 3PO, which is why I mentioned it in the last section and won't keep flagging it. That costume is a mirror, and a mirror on a film set will show you the film set. It also shows up during the carbon freezing scene. Once you know to look at 3PO's head as a mirror rather than a face, you find crew in a surprising number of shots across the original trilogy, which brings us to the carbon freezing chamber and Han's jacket. Across that sequence, Han is wearing his jacket in some shots and not in others. Same continuous moment, cutting back and forth. Lucas partially cleaned this up in later releases, but not completely, and it's still visible in the close-ups. It's one of the most emotionally significant scenes in the entire franchise, and the leading man's outerwear cannot make up its mind. 2 more, then we're done here. After Boba Fett's ship departs with Han aboard, there's a close-up on Leia's face. Lando is in the background behind her, standing upright with his hands on his waist. Cut to the next shot and he's crouching, hands out in front of him. He has covered a fair bit of ground, physically, in no time at all. And finally, when Luke knocks Vader off the platform in the carbon chamber and jumps down after him, the sound design sells it as an enormous drop. Long fall, big impact. Then Mark Hamill's head pops back up into frame, roughly where he started, because the actual set piece was about 6 feet high. 3 more that don't fit the geography neatly. The first is a spaceship that shouldn't be there. In the original 1980 release, in the first wide shot of Vader's Star Destroyer, there's a light on the right side of frame that is quite plainly another Star Destroyer, just cruising through empty space, with no reason to be in the shot. It's a stray element in the composite. That one did get fixed for the 2004 DVD, which makes it a nice test case for the version problem I mentioned earlier. If you own the film on VHS and your mate owns it on Blu-ray, one of you has a mistake in your copy and the other one doesn't, and you're both watching Empire. The second is on Cloud City. When Luke arrives in his X-Wing and lands, he reaches up above his head and presses some controls on the cockpit hatch. Have a look at the hatch. There aren't any. It's a smooth surface. He's operating switches that were never built, which is a thing actors have to do constantly, and which usually gets hidden by not showing the surface. The third is on Dagobah, and it's a lovely bit of accidental characterization. Before Luke has met Yoda, he's fiddling with R2 and says something along the lines of, "Now, all I've got to do is find this Yoda, if he even exists." Which is a strange thing to say. He's there on the direct instruction of a Force ghost. Obi-Wan appeared to him in person, in the snow, and told him where to go and who to find. Luke has more evidence for Yoda's existence than he has for most things in his life at that point, and he's standing in a swamp, doubting it. I've always read that as Luke being cold, wet, fed up, and 18 months into a losing war. But it does sit oddly against the scene that put him there. 16 from Empire then, which people generally regard as the most tightly made film in the series, and it has a bloke's arm in a Wampa costume and a lightsaber with New York stamped on it, which makes sense when you know how it was made. Empire was shot in Norway in conditions that genuinely endangered the crew, on a schedule that ran badly over, with a director fighting for time and a producer mortgaging the company to pay for it. The Wampa arm is visible because somebody was lying in fake snow, with his hand up a puppet, trying to make a monster work in one take. Anyway, Jabba's palace, Return of the Jedi, has a particular flavour of mistake, and it's not really a visual one, it's audio. This film has more lines that don't match the mouths saying them than any other in the saga, and once you clock it, you cannot stop noticing. So rather than walking through the film, I want to start with sound and work outwards. The clearest example is on Endor. Han is bringing the shuttle in, playing it cool with the Imperials, and he tells Chewie to fly casual. Perfect line. Great delivery. The problem is you hear it before Harrison Ford's mouth starts moving. The audio is running ahead of the picture by a beat. Then there's Leia on the same landing. She says, "Come on, General, let's move." Except her lips are quite clearly saying, "Come on, Cap." That one is easy to explain, and I find the explanation quite sweet. At some point in the writing, Han's rank changed. Somebody decided he should be a general by this film rather than a captain, and the line got redubbed, but the picture is the picture, and Carrie Fisher's mouth is still saying the old version. Third one, still on Endor during the speeder bike chase. Luke tells Leia to take one scout while he handles the other two. His lips don't move at all. Not slightly out of sync, not moving. That line was added entirely in post, over a shot where the actor wasn't speaking. And fourth, quieter than the others. When Leia is in the forest and Wicket approaches, she offers him something to eat. Her face is doing something the soundtrack isn't. She's smiling and clearly saying something warm and conversational. What you actually hear is a fairly flat come on. There is a whole other performance in that shot that we simply don't get to hear. Right, everything else, the speeder bikes themselves, are worth a look. In several shots during the chase, you can see the support arms holding the front of the bikes up, which makes sense. They're heavy props with actors on them, and they need to not fall over, but a rig that's meant to be invisible is not invisible. While we're on Endor, the Ewoks After the heroes get caught in the net trap, the Ewoks disarm them, and one of them takes Han's blaster. Look at the hand doing the taking. Those are human fingers, not paws, not gloves, not a costume. Somebody's actual hand coming out of a fursuit, on screen, in focus. I love the Ewok costumes generally. They're one of the great practical achievements of the trilogy, but that shot is a bloke in a suit, and it's a bloke in a suit for long enough to register. Earlier, back at Jabba's palace, Lando has his own moment. He's undercover in the guard helmet, walking through one of the low doorways, and he catches his head on the frame, hard enough to knock the helmet backwards. Billy D. Williams is a tall man, and Jabba's architecture was not built with him in mind. That's 2 head bumps in one trilogy, incidentally, and only one of them is famous. I don't think that's fair on Lando. Now the Battle of Endor. 2 things. The first is an extra, and it's brilliant. Lando and Nien Nunb are flying the Falcon. They realise the Death Star's shield is still up, and the station is operational, and the camera cuts to Nien Nunb. Behind him, one of the background performers is looking directly at the lens with an absolutely enormous grin on his face. He is having the time of his life. He is in Star Wars. I've got no criticism of this at all, to be honest. He's right to be pleased. The second is at the shield generator, and it's a technical one. Han blows the bunker and legs it. As he runs from the building, you can see his reflection running alongside him, almost certainly from a sheet of protective glass between the camera and the explosion, which is a very sensible piece of safety kit that, unfortunately, also functions as a mirror. And in the wide shot of the explosion itself, you can watch debris fly out, hit the edges of the set and bounce back into frame. Now the throne room. And here we get into the other category, which is the stuff the prequels broke. When Luke removes his father's helmet, we see the back of Vader's head, scarred, pale, but essentially intact. Revenge of the Sith would later show us the construction of that suit in some detail, and the two don't sit comfortably together. There's a whole cottage industry of fan explanations for this, and some of them are quite good. It's still a thing 2 films disagree about. The bigger one, though, is Leia and her mother. Luke asks Leia what she remembers of their real mother. She says she was beautiful, kind, but sad. She remembers images and feelings, mostly. 22 years later, Revenge of the Sith has Padme die in childbirth. Leia was minutes old. Whatever she is remembering, she is not remembering with her eyes. There is an in-universe get-out here, which is that Force-sensitive people might retain impressions that ordinary infants wouldn't. I don't hate it. But the plain reading of that scene in 1983 was that Leia had a childhood memory of her mother, and that reading is now unavailable. Last one from this film, and it's the one that always gets a laugh. At the Sarlacc, Luke kicks one of Jabba's guards over the edge, except Mark Hamill's foot does not come particularly close to the man, who then sails off the skiff as though he's been hit by a bus. Fans have taken to calling it the Force Kick, a previously undocumented ability where a Jedi can shove someone over with a general vibe of a kick rather than an actual one. I choose to believe it's canon. 3 more before I let this film go. During the throne room duel, when Vader is stalking through the lower section of the chamber, looking for Luke among the machinery, have a look at what the large structures in that space are actually made of. In a couple of shots, the surface is read very clearly as painted board rather than metal. It's a set that was built to be lit from a particular angle and shot from a particular distance, and the fight moves through it more thoroughly than the set was ever designed to survive. Then there's the Death Star schematic, which is a lovely one, because it's a mistake that got inherited. When the Rebel briefing shows the second Death Station structure, the super laser dish is drawn, sitting on the equatorial trench. It shouldn't be. It sits above the trench. And the interesting bit is that A New Hope has the same apparent error in its own briefing. So either this is a deliberate visual callback to the first film, or somebody used the old diagram as a reference and copied the problem forward. Both are entirely plausible. I lean towards the callback mostly because I want to. And the third is Boba Fett, who I'd argue gets the least dignified exit of any significant character in the trilogy. Han, who cannot see, swings a pole. It catches Boba's jetpack. The jetpack fires, sends him into the side of the barge, and he bounces into the Sarlacc, making a noise. That's it. The most feared bounty hunter in the galaxy is undone by a blind man with a stick, off camera, in about 4 seconds. That's not a technical error, obviously. It's a choice. But it's the choice that meant every subsequent piece of media had to work out how to get him back out again. And that's had consequences for about 4 decades of Star Wars storytelling. 2 more, quickly, and then I'll stop. The Ewoks bringing down the Empire. This isn't a technical error, and I'm not going to be sniffy about it, because I love that sequence. And I think the underlying idea is sound, a low-technology force, with total knowledge of the terrain defeating an occupying army is one of the oldest true stories there is. The bit that doesn't hold is the specific mechanics. Logs swung on ropes crushing armoured walkers, rocks stopping vehicles designed to survive orbital bombardment. The AT-ST is a military machine built by a galaxy-spanning war economy, and it is defeated repeatedly by trees. And the shield generator itself. The bunker on Endor is the single point of protection for the second Death Star, on which the Emperor is personally standing. During a battle he is personally engineered as a trap. It has a back door. Not a metaphorical back door, an actual secondary entrance that the Ewoks know about and walk the rebels straight through. The trap works right up until the moment it doesn't, and the thing that undoes the most elaborate plan in the trilogy is a side passage nobody bothered to lock. 17 from Return of the Jedi. And it's the last of the original 3, which means the next stretch is where things get properly complicated, because from here on, the films start arguing with each other, as much as with themselves. It's worth flagging what actually changes about the mistakes from this point on, because it's a real shift and not just my imagination. Everything so far has essentially been physical. A jacket, a glove, a door frame, a bit of tarpaulin, things that exist in a room and were photographed by accident. From The Phantom Menace onwards, an enormous proportion of what's on screen isn't in a room at all. It's rendered, composited, assembled from elements shot months apart on different continents. You get far fewer crew members in shot because there's often no crew in the shot to begin with. What you get instead is continuity errors of logic. Hands that swap sides between takes that were never physically adjacent. Objects that exist in one layer and not another. Lines of dialogue laid over faces that weren't saying them. And, increasingly, contradictions with material made decades earlier by people who had no idea any of this was coming. Different craft, different failure modes, same amount of tired people trying to hit a release date. I want to say one thing before I start on this film, and then I'll leave it alone. The Phantom Menace has been watched more critically than almost any other film ever made. Not more often, more critically. An entire generation went through it frame by frame, looking for problems, at exactly the moment the internet made sharing those findings easy. So the mistakes list here is unusually long, and I don't think that means the film is unusually sloppy. It means it got audited harder. Right, on with it. Watto's shop. Jar Jar is mucking about with things he shouldn't be touching, activates a pit droid, and in the commotion, he knocks over a protocol droid, along with some other bits and pieces. Cut back a moment later, and the protocol droid is upright again, standing there quite happily. Nobody picked it up. It picked itself up, apparently, which for a droid is at least plausible. Naboo and the droid army is entering Theed. The film cuts to the Queen looking out of a palace window as they advance. Bottom right of the frame, on the set, there is a large ILM painted on in what looks like red spray paint. Industrial Light and Magic, signing their own work by accident. That's a matte painting or a set piece with the effects house's name still on it. and it went out in a film that made nearly $1 billion. Staying on Naboo, in the Otto Gunga boardroom, as Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon turn to leave, Ewan McGregor's lapel microphone is visible just inside his tunic. Small, dark, and definitely not Jedi standard issue. Then there's Darth Maul on Tatooine. He arrives, finds the location of the Jedi, and takes his speeder bike out. On the ground in that sequence you can see a pair of tyre tracks. Not speeder marks, tyre tracks, from a car or a truck, presumably a production vehicle that drove across the location before they shot. Now the pod race, which is a genuinely brilliant sequence and also a bit of a continuity minefield. When Anakin and Padme arrive at the hangar, Anakin is noticeably taller in the close-ups than in the wides, and Padme's hair is slightly different. There's a straightforward reason for this, and it's the sort of production detail I find much more interesting than the error itself. Those close-ups were shot almost a year after principal photography as part of the extensive pickups the film went through. Jake Lloyd was a child. Children grow. You cannot ask a boy to stop being taller for the convenience of a shot. Within the race, there's a shot of Anakin being pursued by Sebulba's pod, and Sebulba isn't in it. The cockpit is empty, a sentient racing pod, chasing a child, entirely of its own accord. And here's the thing that makes that one stand out. George Lucas has gone back into this film. He extended the pod race, he extended Coruscant, he replaced the Yoda puppet with a digital Yoda for the Blu-ray release. He has had multiple opportunities to fix an empty cockpit and has chosen not to, which tells you something about what he thinks these re-releases are for. They're not repair jobs, they're revisions. Then Anakin wins and he shouts something like, "Mum, I did it." The words don't match his mouth. That's another post-production line laid over existing picture. Same as the return of the Jedi speeder bike one. And it's a very common fix when a performance is right but the reading isn't. Later, in the Theed hangar, there's the reverse problem. Anakin's mouth starts moving before the line comes out. Picture ahead of sound this time rather than behind it. And once he's up in the starfighter, there's a lovely little physics goof. He says he'll try spinning, calls it a good trick, and turns the controls to his left. The ship spins right, which we know is wrong because earlier in the same sequence, right after the autopilot cuts out, he says let's go left, turns left, and the shot tilts left. The film establishes its own convention and then immediately breaks it. Last two, the duel with Darth Maul. During the fight, there's a quick cut where Obi-Wan is holding Qui-Gon's lightsaber in his right hand as he lunges, and in the very next frame, it's in his left. No swap on screen, no reason for one. That's what happens when a fight sequence gets assembled from multiple takes shot on different days. The choreography matches, the grip doesn't. There's a related one that fan editors have quietly fixed for years, which is that Obi-Wan's Padawan braid appears on the wrong side of his head in at least one shot. Easy mistake to make, because the simplest way to correct a framing problem in the edit is to flip the shots horizontally. And if you do that to a character with an asymmetrical haircut, the haircut tells on you. And the 10th is not a visual error at all. It's a plot one, and it's the one I actually think about most. At the beginning of the film, Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan escape the destroyer droids on the Trade Federation ship using a burst of force speed. They move faster than should be possible. The film establishes clearly that this is a thing Jedi can do. At the end of the film, Obi-Wan is trapped behind those energy shields in the Theed generator complex, watching Qui-Gon fight Maul alone, unable to reach him in time. He could have run. He used the ability roughly 90 minutes earlier. It's in the same film. And I don't think it's a cheap gotcha, because that's the scene the whole rest of the trilogy is built on. Qui-Gon dies, Obi-Wan takes on a boy he isn't ready to train. Everything follows from that. It's a load-bearing death, and the film has already shown us the tool that would have prevented it. Right, a few extras before I move on, because this film rewards a rummage. The Queen's arrival on Coruscant. As her ship comes down to meet the Senate delegation, the sky above is absolutely heaving with traffic. ships crossing constantly in every direction, which is the whole point of the shot. The Naboo cruiser is chrome. Mirror finish, deliberately so, because it's a beautiful design and the reflectivity is the entire idea. There are no reflections of any of that traffic on it. That's a rendering decision rather than an oversight. Reflections were extraordinarily expensive to compute in 1998, and you simply didn't do them unless you had to. But it means the ship is a mirror that isn't mirroring anything, parked underneath the busiest sky in the galaxy. Then in the Mos Espa hangar, when Anakin is begging Qui-Gon to let him come along, there's a yellow stick with a ball on the top of it in the background. Watch it across the scene. It goes, nobody touches it, nobody walks past it, it's simply present in some shots and absent in others. And there's a species problem, which is the kind of thing that only bothers people who read the books, but is a proper contradiction, if you did. Before this film came out, the spin-off material established that the Quarren shared a homeworld with the Mon Calamari, and that both species only made contact with the wider galaxy relatively late, during Palpatine's rule. Then the Phantom Menace turns up with Quarren wandering around the streets of Mos Espa and sitting in the crowd at the Boonta Eve pod race, decades early. There's even a Quarren senator visible in the Galactic Senate. That's not a continuity error inside the film. That's a film cheerfully overwriting a decade of published material because somebody in the creature shop had a good design and wanted to use it, which happened constantly in this era and is one of the main reasons the whole expanded universe eventually got reclassified. One last thing, and it's not a mistake at all, it's a deliberate signature. During the battle on Naboo, Jar Jar destroys a battle droid, and on the back of that droid is the serial number 1138. That's THX 1138, Lucas's first feature. He's been putting that number into his films since the 70s. It's in the original trilogy too, and once you know it, you start seeing it everywhere. Two more that are worth the time, and they're both about things the film introduced that it then had to live with. The first is R2-D2's rockets. He doesn't fly in this film, that comes in Attack of the Clones, but this is where the prequel version of R2 gets established as a droid with a solution for everything. And once he can fly, the original trilogy has a permanent problem, because there is a very famous scene in A New Hope where he cannot get up some stairs, and an even more famous one where he simply falls over in the sand. The usual fix is that the boosters were single use, or damaged, or removed during a service. Fine. But there's no version of this where the audience of 1977 was meant to be looking at a droid who used to be able to fly. The second is Anakin building C-3PO, which is the change I think has the widest blast radius of anything in the prequels. It means 3PO was made by Darth Vader. It means he spent years in the household of Vader's mother. It means that when Vader walks past him on the Tantive Ivor and later on Cloud City, he is standing in front of something he made with his own hands as a child and nothing registers. And it means that when Obi-Wan meets 3PO again on Tatooine and gives no sign of recognition, we're being asked to believe that a Jedi Master forgot a specific protocol droid he'd flown across the galaxy with. Now the memory wipe at the end of Revenge of the Sith does clean up 3PO's side of it. That's genuinely a good fix. It just doesn't help anybody else in the room. And I want to be clear that I'm not annoyed about this. It's a lovely idea that the boy who becomes the villain built the fussy little droid we've loved since we were children. It's a proper piece of writing. It just costs more than it looks like it costs. And this film is where the bill starts running. That's 16 from The Phantom Menace, 10 years pass in universe, and considerably more mistakes accumulate. I want to open this one with a mistake that isn't a mistake, because it's the single best joke in the entire prequel trilogy, and almost nobody notices it. On Kamino, Jango Fett is retreating to his ship with Boba, and as he boards, he bumps his head. That is not Temuera Morrison being clumsy. That is George Lucas, 25 years on, deliberately restaging the Stormtrooper doorframe as a gag. He put the most famous accident in his own filmography into a film on purpose. It's confirmed in the commentary, which means that between staging Attribute in 2002 and adding the sound effect in 2004, Lucas spent a decade steadily converting a bloke's headache into a running bit. I think that's the most likeable thing about the man. Right, on to the ones that are actually errors. The big structural one in this film is Sifo Dyas, and it doesn't require any deep lore knowledge. The film contradicts itself out loud, twice, about 40 minutes apart. Obi-Wan arrives on Kamino and is told the clone army was ordered by Master Sifo Dyas. Later, reporting back to the Council, he tells Mace Windu and Yoda that the Kaminoans received the order almost 10 years ago, and that he was under the impression Sifo Dyas had been killed before that. Attack of the Clones is set 10 years after the Phantom Menace, so one version has Sifo Dyas placing the order after the Battle of Naboo, the other has him dead before it. Both statements come out of the same character's mouth in the same film, and nothing on screen reconciles them. You can argue Obi-Wan is lying to the Kaminoans, or that he's been given a date off screen. Fine, but the film never says so, and it's a fairly significant thing to be vague about, given the entire Clone Wars hang off it. Second big one, and this is my favourite kind of mistake because it's an object rather than a line, the Death Star. At the end of the film, in the Geonosis war room, Count Dooku is handed the plans for the ultimate weapon, and the hologram is unmistakably the Death Star. Super laser dish, equatorial trench, the lot. The problem is that A New Hope is set over 20 years later, and the entire first act of that film, and eventually the entire plot of Rogue One, depends on those plans being an incredibly closely guarded secret that costs a lot of people their lives to steal. So either the Empire spent 2 decades failing to update a design that a separatist leader was casually handed on a data card, or somebody in the art department really wanted a nice hologram for the end of the film. I know which I'd put money on. Third, and this one's more of a tone thing than an error, but it's cited constantly, and I think fairly. At the end of The Phantom Menace, at Qui-Gon's funeral, the Council is deeply rattled. The Sith are back. There are always 2 of them. This is presented as the defining crisis facing the Jedi Order. Then Attack of the Clones opens a decade later, and nobody mentions the Sith, not once. The Council is entirely focused on the Separatist crisis and the clone army, and the Sith only re-enter the conversation when Dooku volunteers the name Darth Sidious to Obi-Wan on Geonosis, essentially unprompted. 10 years of the galaxy's greatest threat, and it takes the villain reminding them. Now the visual ones. There's a lightsaber continuity slip in the arena sequence that gets flagged a lot, hilts and blades not quite matching between cuts during the mass Jedi fight. That whole sequence was assembled from an enormous number of composited elements, and when you're building a battle out of 200 separate plates, something is going to end up in the wrong hand. Padmé's costume in the droid factory has a similar issue. Her top gets torn in the conveyor sequence, and the damage doesn't stay consistent. The tear moves and changes size across the fight, which is a classic problem when a costume has multiple duplicates in different states of distress, and they get shot out of order. Then there's Anakin's mechanical hand, which is the last thing to happen to him in the film, and therefore the thing most likely to appear early by accident. There are shots where the wrong hand appears to be gloved before the injury occurs. This one I'd flag gently rather than confidently, it's often reported, and the black glove he wears throughout muddies it considerably. 2 more. The whole Naboo romance sequence has a persistent problem with the fire in the fireplace behind Anakin and Padmé, which changes size and shape between angles. That's not laziness so much as physics. You cannot ask a fire to hold a pose between takes, but it is on screen and it is inconsistent. And finally, one that isn't the film's fault, but is worth sitting with. Boba Fett is established here as an unaltered clone of Jango, raised as his son, which is lovely. It also means that when Boba turns up in Empire, roughly 25 years later, he should be in his mid-30s. Nothing in Empire suggests he's a young man. Nothing in Empire suggests he isn't either, but the prequels quietly assigned an age to a character who had previously had none, and a lot of what people thought they knew about him stopped being possible. Right, a few more. The Coruscant speeder chase at the start is a fantastic sequence, and it has a persistent problem with traffic. Ships travelling in one direction in one shot are travelling the other way a few frames later, and the density of the traffic changes considerably between angles depending on what the shot needs to feel like. That's not a slip so much as a stylistic choice. The chase is cut for rhythm, not geography, but the result is a city whose road layout reorganises itself around whoever's being pursued. There's a related one in the same chase. Zam Wesell's speeder takes damage progressively throughout, which is well tracked, right up until the moment it isn't. The scorching and the missing panels don't hold consistently across the final stretch before the crash. Then there's the arena beasts. When Padme, Anakin and Obi-Wan are chained to the pillars, the positions of the chains and the state of the pillars vary between the wide shots, which are digital, and the close-ups, which were shot practically against blue screen. The two versions of the same space don't quite line up. That's the fundamental tension of that entire production. The actors are in a small room, and the room is somewhere else entirely, and the two have to be reconciled in post by people who weren't there. And a law one that I think is genuinely a problem rather than a nitpick. Obi-Wan arrives on Kamino, and the Kaminoans have been expecting a Jedi for 10 years. They've been building an army of 200,000 soldiers, with 1 million more on the way, at enormous expense on behalf of an organisation with a public headquarters on Coruscant. Nobody from that organisation has been to check, not once in a decade, and nobody sent the invoice anywhere. The Republic is paying for this, presumably, and the Republic Senate is a body that argues for 11 hours about trade routes. A military expenditure on that scale should have left a paper trail visible from orbit. The explanation, obviously, is that Palpatine arranged all of it and buried it, which works. It just requires the Jedi Order and the Galactic Senate to be so comprehensively incurious that it's a bit hard to be sad when they lose. Two last ones, and they're both about Kamino, because Kamino is where this film keeps its problems. The first is the rain. It rains constantly on that planet. That's the whole visual identity of the place. Obi-Wan lands in it, walks through it, gets thoroughly soaked. Then he's inside, dry in a matter of moments, wearing heavy Jedi robes made of what appears to be several kilos of wool. Those garments do not dry in a corridor. Small thing, but it's the sort of small thing that used to get caught. And in a fully digital production, there's often nobody standing next to the actor with a continuity Polaroid, because half the environment doesn't exist yet. The second is Jango's armour, and this one has a proper knock-on effect. The film establishes Jango Fett as the genetic template, wearing what is unmistakably Mandalorian armour, which passes to Boba. It never once calls him a Mandalorian in dialogue, which was fine in 2002 and became a considerable problem 2 decades on, when the television material had to work out what his relationship to Mandalore actually was, given that the armour is sacred and he apparently just had some. That's not an error in the film, it's an ambiguity in the film that later material had to treat as a puzzle, and there's a real difference between the two. A lot of what gets called a Star Wars plot hole is actually this, a thing that was simply unspecified at the time, which becomes load-bearing later because somebody built on it. I think that's the honest way to look at most of the prequel-era complaints, actually. These films weren't made as the middle of a 9-part structure. They were made as the beginning of a 3-part one, by a man who had already told the end of the story, and was working backwards. The joins show. They were always going to show. 16 from Attack of the Clones, and now the one where everything goes wrong on purpose. No plot summary for this one. You know what happens? Straight in. Order 66. The montage where the Jedi are killed across the galaxy, one after another, and it is genuinely one of the best cut sequences in the saga. In among it, Ki-Adi-Mundi turns to the clones beside him and shouts, "Come on." His mouth doesn't move, not out of sync, closed. The line was laid over the shot afterwards, and there's no attempt to hide it, which is a strange choice in a sequence that's otherwise so carefully assembled. And it's the sort of thing that happens when a scene gets recut late and needs a line of dialogue to carry the geography. Now Newt Gunray, he turns up in all three prequels, and by this film, he does not look like the same character. Between episodes 1 and 3, his facial design has changed noticeably, and his costume has changed almost completely. The long draping headpiece is gone, the proportions are different, and if you put stills side by side, you'd reasonably assume they were two members of the same species rather than the same individual. Neimoidian designs got refined across the trilogy, which is fine, except this is a recurring character with a name and a plot function, not background dressing. Here's one I only noticed because somebody pointed it out to me, and now I check it every time. When Bail Organa lands at the Jedi Temple after the Purge and approaches the troopers on the landing platform, some of them are quite clearly right-handed, and others are quite clearly left-handed. They are genetic copies of one man. In principle, they should all favour the same side. I want to be fair on this one, though, because it has a proper defence. Handedness isn't purely genetic. Identical twins can differ. So a clone army with some lefties in it is not actually impossible. It's just visually odd, and the film draws attention to their uniformity constantly. The Wookiee zipper, though, is my favourite thing in this whole film, and it's not even real. For 2 decades, people have said there's a visible zip in one of the Wookiee costumes on Kashyyyk, in the shot behind Yoda, just after Order 66 is given. Right-hand side of frame. It's on every list. It's not a zip. It's a strip of background visible between the Wookiee's legs. Once you know that, you can't see the zip anymore, which is a nice reversal of how these things usually go. There's a button in this film that gets reported as an error constantly, and it's another gag. Near the end, Padme presses it to start her ship. Same button, shot the same way, that had a completely different function in Attack of the Clones. Same prop, same framing, doing 2 unrelated things in 2 films. Lucas messing about again, which by this point in his career seems to have been most of the fun of the job. Now, Palpatine's face. This one has never sat right with me. He's disfigured during the duel with Mace Windu, and the film's own explanation is that the lightning rebounds on him. But the disfigurement is inconsistent in a way that's caused arguments for 2 decades, including whether it was ever meant to be an injury at all, or the dark side finally showing on the outside. The film's dialogue points one way, and the expanded universe pointed another, and the result is that a fairly central visual has no settled explanation. And then there's a single line, spoken in a swamp in 1980, that the prequels quietly had to work around. In Empire, Obi-Wan's ghost tells Luke that Yoda is the Jedi Master who instructed him. Take that at face value, and Yoda trained Obi-Wan personally. The prequels establish that Obi-Wan was trained by Qui-Gon Jinn. Yoda taught the younglings in a group class, which we see in Attack of the Clones. So technically, Obi-Wan was instructed by Yoda at some point in his childhood, along with everybody else in the building. It works, just about. It also isn't what the line meant in 1980. Which brings me to the hiding plan, and I'm sorry, but this one is genuinely daft. At the end of this film, the Jedi decide to split the twins to protect them from Vader. Leia goes to Alderaan, into the household of a senator, with no obvious connection to the Skywalkers. Sensible. Luke goes to Tatooine, Anakin's home planet, to live with Anakin's stepbrother, under the surname Skywalker. And Obi-Wan goes with him, to live in a hut a few miles away, under the alias Ben Kenobi. It works in the sense that nobody finds them for 19 years, but it works the way leaving your keys in the ignition works if nobody happens to walk past. The operating table then, the scene where the suit goes on. It's the emotional peak of the film, and it's got a well-documented continuity slip sitting right in the middle of it. In one shot, Anakin is already fully clothed in the suit, missing only the neck piece and helmet. In others, the assembly is at a different stage. The sequence cuts back and forth through the construction process, and the order doesn't hold up, which is a shame because everything else about that scene is superb, and I'd rather not have anything to say about it at all. And Leia's memory of her mother, briefly, because we've already been here. Padme dies minutes after the birth. That's the contradiction I mentioned earlier, landing in its final form, and this is the film that lands it. A few more, and then we're done with Lucas. The opening battle above Coruscant is one of the most complex shots ever attempted at the time, and it has a scale problem. The number of ships and their relative sizes don't stay consistent as the camera moves through the engagement. Vessels that read as capital ships in one pass read as considerably smaller in another. When you're compositing hundreds of elements into a single continuous move, that's an extremely easy thing to lose track of, and an extremely hard thing to fix. Then there's General Grievous and the cough. He doesn't have one in the Clone Wars material that leads directly into this film. He arrives here with a persistent, wet, mechanical cough that's used to characterize him as decaying and half alive. There's an in-universe explanation involving Mace Windu crushing his chest plate, which was worked out afterwards to reconcile it. On its own terms in this film, it's a character trait that simply appears. There's a droid problem too. On the invisible hand, the battle droids are noticeably chattier and more comic than they've been previously, commenting on things, complaining, doing bits, which is fine and often funny, but they're presented across the trilogy as fairly limited units, and here they've got the timing of a sitcom cast, and two on Mustafar. The first is straightforward, the lava. Anakin and Obi-Wan fight for a considerable time in extremely close proximity to molten rock, on structures that are visibly collapsing into it, and there's a stretch on the mining platform where the survivable distance from that lava changes shot by shot depending on what the choreography needs. Sometimes it's lethal, sometimes it's atmosphere. The second is the injury itself. Obi-Wan takes Anakin's legs and his remaining arm on the bank. Then Anakin catches fire. Then he is retrieved by Palpatine and rebuilt. The amount of time that has to elapse between Obi-Wan walking away and Palpatine's shuttle arriving is not addressed, and it needs to be quite short. Meanwhile, Obi-Wan has flown to Polis Massa, where Padme is dying, and the two events are cut as though they're simultaneous. Somebody, somewhere in that sequence, has covered an enormous amount of ground very quickly. And two final ones from this film, both of which are about things the story needs rather than things the camera caught. The first is Padme's death. The medical droid says she's lost the will to live and that there's nothing physically wrong with her. This is a droid on a fully equipped medical station, attending a woman who has just been force-choked by her husband and who is, by any reading, in extreme physical distress. The diagnosis exists because the film needs her to die and doesn't want to say that Anakin killed her, and the result is a line that has irritated people ever since. There's a whole in-universe explanation involving Palpatine drawing her life force away to sustain Vader, and it's a genuinely elegant piece of fan reasoning that the films have never confirmed. I quite like it. It's also doing a lot of work that a script should have done. The second is the Jedi Temple beacon, and it's my favourite bit of engineering in the whole film. After the Purge, Obi-Wan and Yoda return to the temple and recalibrate the distress signal to warn surviving Jedi to stay away. Sensible, effective, saves lives, except it means the Jedi Order's emergency system had a single point of failure, sitting in a building that had just been overrun, operable by anybody who got inside. The most secretive, most cautious institution in the galaxy left its come here button in the lobby, which, honestly, is consistent with everything else we've seen them do across 3 films. They didn't notice a Sith Lord in the next office for 13 years. I'd stopped expecting operational security by that point, 17 from Revenge of the Sith, and that's the 6 Lucas films done, which is roughly halfway, and that leaves the pair of one-offs, which have a very different sort of problem. This is the short section. 2 films, 8 entries, and both of them have the same underlying issue, which is that they were made under enormous pressure, and it shows in the seams. Let's start with the statue, because it's the neatest one in the whole video. On Jedha, when Bodhi Rook is introduced, there's an enormous fallen Jedi statue lying in the sand. First shot, it's lying on its left side. By the end of the scene, as the camera pulls out, it's lying on its right. An 80-foot stone figure has rolled over. Nobody helped it. What makes this one genuinely interesting rather than just funny is that the left side version is the one that appears in the second trailer. So you can watch the 2 versions of the same shot side by side, and the difference tells you the sequence was reassembled between the marketing push and the release. Which brings me to the thing Rogue One is really famous for, among people who like this sort of stuff. Roughly 40% of that film was reshot. Gareth Edwards stayed on, Tony Gilroy came in to write and oversee new material, and the second and third acts changed substantially. One editor went through the promotional material afterwards and isolated 46 individual shots that appeared in trailers and TV spots and never made the final cut. Jyn on a communications tower facing down, a TIE fighter, K2SO and Cassian running through an Imperial base with the data tapes, alternate Saw Gerrera dialogue. None of that is a mistake strictly, but it's the largest gap between advertised film and delivered film in modern Star Wars. And it's the reason so many of Rogue One's continuity oddities exist in the first place. Right. The rest, Saw Gerrera's breathing apparatus moves. It normally sits centrally on his chest, a bit like Vader's control panel, but in at least one close-up during his conversation with Jyn, it's shifted off to the side. Presumably somebody was trying a slightly different look on a pickup day, and it didn't get matched back. The U-Wing has 2 different doors. When it's sitting still, the practical build, the design on the door, is one thing. When it takes off and the digital version takes over, it's another, which is a strange one to let through, given the whole point of building the practical version is that the digital one can copy it. Then there's Krennic's height, which I'd never have thought about if I hadn't seen it written down. In their scenes together, Krennic is a bit shorter than Tarkin, comes up to about his ears. He's also about that much shorter than Vader, but in A New Hope, Tarkin is considerably shorter than Vader. So the 2 relationships can't both be true. Somewhere in there, somebody has gained or lost several inches. And in the space battle over Scarif, there's a shot of Gold Leader in his Y-Wing cockpit, where you can see the edge of a planetary shield gate through the rear window. That's reused footage from the 1977 trench run, digitally repainted so the background reads as the shield gate instead, which I think is lovely rather than lazy. They went and got the actual original platers. Now Solo, 2 entries and they're both about lore rather than lighting. The first is the parsec. Han's boast in A New Hope is that he made the Kessel Run in less than 12 parsecs. A parsec is a unit of distance, not time. So for the best part of half a century, the line has been read one of 2 ways. Either as a writing slip that nobody caught, or the reading most fans landed on, as Han talking rubbish to impress a farm boy and an old man who won't know the difference. Solo makes it true. He takes a shortcut, He shortens the actual distance. The boast is accurate. I have complicated feelings about this. It's a tidy piece of engineering. It also takes a moment that characterized Han as a chancer and turns it into a straightforward statement of fact. And I'm not sure that's a trade worth making. He was more fun when he might have been lying. The second is the hat. Early in the film, Han nicks a hat off a child in the street. Shot changes, and the child is standing with his mother and sister, wearing the hat again. Either Han gave it straight back off screen, or the reverse angle was shot before the hat business was worked out and nobody noticed. A few more from Rogue One, because the reshoots left more seams than that. K2SO at the Scarif control panel shoots 2 stormtroopers to his right. Then he shifts his aim slightly left and shoots the same 2 stormtroopers again. The first pair are gone, so it can't be them, and the second pair are identical. Somebody reused a plate. During that same battle, the rebel fleet arrives right up close to the shield gate, level with the Imperial ships. Then when Blue Squadron makes its attack run, they're suddenly high above it. The fleet has changed altitude between cuts, which matters in a sequence where the geography of the shield gate is the whole tactical problem. There's a landing gear one that's purely a dialogue slip. A character states the gear has locked in place. And then about a minute later, you watch it deploy perfectly normally. And on Iado, when Jin reaches her father, there are strands of hair falling across her forehead, some on the left and some on the right. A few shots later, they're distributed evenly. Rain, wind, a fair amount of running about, and a hair and makeup department doing their best on a mountainside. I'll give you a bonus one. That's my favourite thing in the film. When K2SO slaps Cassian on Jedha, the slap was improvised. Alan Tudyk did it. Diego Luna wasn't expecting it. And you can watch Luna cover his face with his hand to hide the fact that he's laughing. The edit then cuts to a shot with his hand down and back to a shot with it up again, which is a continuity error caused entirely by an actor trying not to corpse. They kept it because it's better than the alternative. 2 more from Solo. Beckett hands Han his DL-44 blaster in a deleted scene that isn't in the finished film, which means Han simply has the gun with no explanation for where it came from. And moments later, Beckett takes it back with a different hand than the one that would make sense given where he's standing. The other is Darth Maul, who turns up at the end and confuses a lot of people who only watch the films, because he was cut in half in The Phantom Menace, which is set decades earlier. He survived. That's established in the Clone Wars, along with the mechanical legs he's visibly standing on here. So it isn't a mistake. It's just a film that assumes you've watched an animated series. In a franchise that then complains people find it confusing. Right, and I can't do this section without the 2 digital faces because they're the thing everyone remembers. Rogue One recreated Peter Cushing as Tarkin and a young Carrie Fisher as Leia, both digitally, both extensively. Cushing had died in 1994. Whether these count as mistakes depends entirely on what you think a mistake is. They're not errors in the sense that anybody got something wrong. They're the intended result of an enormous amount of skilled work. But they were widely noticed as artificial at the time, particularly Tarkin, who has a great deal of screen time and a lot of dialogue. And there's a fairly broad consensus that the technology in 2016 wasn't quite there for sustained close-ups under bright light. What's interesting is what happened afterwards. The same techniques got used again a few years later, and the results were noticeably better, which means Rogue One's version is now the visibly older one, a film that will keep looking slightly more artificial every year, while everything around it improves. That's a genuinely new category of aging for a film to do. And the last one from Solo is the Falcon. It looks different. Deliberately so, it's meant to be newer, cleaner, and it has that detachable escape craft slotted into the front mandibles, which is a lovely explanation for the gap that's been there since 1977. The problem is the timeline. Solo is set roughly a decade before A New Hope. and the interior configuration doesn't quite match up with what we know, and the exterior takes an enormous amount of damage across the film that then has to be understood as part of the ship's history. Lando's version is white and pristine. Han's is a wreck. 10 years, one paint job, and a substantially rebuilt front end. I don't hold it against the film. If you're going to show us the Falcon before Han had it, it has to look different, or there's no point showing it. It just means the ship now has a documented service history that has to be squared with the most photographed spacecraft in cinema. That's 17. Short section, as promised. Now for the trilogy that argues with itself, I'm going to organise this one differently, because these three films disagree with each other far more than they disagree with themselves. So rather than going film by film, I'm grouping by the argument. These are errors, by the way, not a verdict. That conversation has been had, extensively, by everyone. And it is not what anybody wants at this hour. The clearest one is the weather. The Last Jedi opens where The Force Awakens ended, Rey on the cliff, holding out the lightsaber to Luke. Direct continuation, same moment. In The Force Awakens, it's grey, overcast, and raining. In The Last Jedi, it's sunny. That's a 2-year gap between productions and a different director, and the sky did not get the memo. Then there's Luke's X-Wing. In The Last Jedi, it's underwater and visibly wrecked, with a wing panel missing, because Luke has taken the panel off and used it as the door of his hut. That's a lovely detail. It's also a fairly major structural modification, and the ship's condition doesn't hold up consistently against how it's treated elsewhere in the trilogy. The map is the one that bothers me most. The whole plot of The Force Awakens is a hunt for a map leading to Luke Skywalker. Then The Last Jedi establishes that Luke came to Ahch-To specifically to be alone and to die there. So why is there a map to him? There's a decent patch available. Kylo Ren says the rest of the map was recovered from Imperial archives and calls it the map to Skywalker, and the supporting material frames it as a route to the first Jedi Temple rather than to Luke personally. That works if you've read the books. It doesn't work if you've only watched the films, where it is repeatedly and plainly called a map to Skywalker, and the one that goes furthest back is the Emperor. He returns in The Rise of Skywalker with no setup in either of the two preceding films. Not a mention, not a hint, not a line. The first act of the third film has to do all the work of establishing a villain who is meant to have been orchestrating everything. The Last Jedi has one I think is genuinely careless, because it involves the same character in consecutive shots. Watch Leia's hands. There are close-ups where her nails are long and manicured, immediately followed by shots where they're short and unmanicured. It happens when Poe reaches out to her, and again when Luke gives her the dice. Somebody was doing pickups without checking the reference. Then there's the Praetorian Guard fight in Snoke's throne room, which is one of the best shot sequences in the trilogy, and has a blade that just evaporates. One of the guards splits his weapon into two blades. In the shot where he gets Rey into an arm lock, the blade in his left hand vanishes mid-shot, and it isn't on the floor in the wider shot afterwards either. The hand is obscured by Rey's body at the moment it disappears, which is how it got through. There's also a plot mechanics one in that film that bothers me more than it should. The First Order is able to target the fleeing transports because DJ told them about the plan. But the only people DJ ever met were Rose and Finn, and they left on their side mission before Holdo explained the transport plan to anyone. DJ shouldn't know, and at the very start Leia orders Poe to pull back. He cuts his comms and attacks the dreadnought anyway, which is framed as him disobeying alone. Except there's an entire bomber wing waiting behind him for exactly that attack to succeed. It's difficult to be a lone maverick with a support fleet. This film has more small continuity slips than the other two combined, and most of them involve the lightsaber. Early on, Rey gives Leia the lightsaber for safekeeping. A couple of minutes later, there's a shot of Rey reading the Jedi texts with that same lightsaber hanging on the left side of her belt. 2 minutes after that, Leia gives it back to her. It's been in 3 places at once. Elsewhere it hops from the right side of her belt to a pouch on her left, between a wide shot and a close-up of her face. On the Death Star wreckage, Rey enters the Emperor's vault, wearing a satchel slung across her body. She falls backwards out of it, after the dark Rey vision, still wearing the satchel. Then she stands to face Kylo Ren, and it's gone. 2 more from that film. The first is the Throne Room. In Return of the Jedi, the Emperor's chamber sits at the top of an enormous tower, reachable only by lift. In The Rise of Skywalker, the wreckage version is essentially a corner room off a corridor. The architecture has been rearranged for the fight. The second is the 2 Falcons. During the lightspeed skipping sequence, there's a shot with 2 Millennium Falcons visible on screen at once. There was an explanation floated involving reflective spires. It was, by most accounts, a rendering error, and the spires were an attempt to explain it away after the fact. Last one, and it's the neatest small contradiction in the trilogy. In The Rise of Skywalker, C-3PO's memory has to be wiped to retrieve a Sith inscription, because his programming forbids him from translating it. It's a proper emotional beat. He takes one last look at his friends. But in Return of the Jedi, 3PO quite happily overrides his own programming to impersonate a deity for a village of Ewoks. He objects, he grumbles, and then he does it. There's one continuity error that runs through the entire trilogy, and I like it because nobody caught it for years. The lightsaber. Luke's, originally Anakin's, the one Rey ends up with. Look at where the ignition button sits on the hilt. In the sequels, it's up near the top. In both the original trilogy and the prequels, it's noticeably lower down, closer to the middle. Same weapon, 3 films, wrong switch. That's a replica prop built from photographs rather than from the original, which is exactly how you'd expect it to happen 30 years later, and it's now permanently different. The Force Awakens has one I've never been able to unsee. Han and Chewie take the Falcon to assault Starkiller Base, an entire planet-sized weapon, defended by the whole First Order, and they bring exactly one other person. Finn. The ship holds a lot more than that. The Resistance presumably had someone spare. Then there's Rey understanding Chewbacca. She's a scavenger from Jakku who has never met a Wookiee, and she follows his growling perfectly from the first conversation. Han already understood Chewbacca when they first met. It's not impossible. Shiriwook is a language and languages can be learned, but the film never suggests where she'd have learned it, and it treats her fluency as unremarkable. The Last Jedi has 2 small physics ones that make me smile. The first is the yacht on Canto Bight going over a waterfall and then continuing to fly along horizontally, at which point its enormous keel emerges from the water. That's a river directly above a waterfall. Rivers are often shallow, directly above waterfalls. That's what makes them waterfalls. The second is the Western Move, where somebody blows the smoke off the end of a blaster barrel. There is no gunpowder in this galaxy. Blasters do not produce smoke, and never have in any other film. It's a great shot. It's also importing a piece of iconography from a genre that runs on chemistry Star Wars doesn't have. And 2 final ones from The Rise of Skywalker. Snap Wexley's death is a properly effective moment, and the ship he dies in isn't the ship you watched him get into. He boards an A-wing during the launch sequence and is flying something else by the time it matters. And the voices. At the climax, Rey hears the voices of Jedi past encouraging her, and among them is Mace Windu. The trilogy's own established rule, set out clearly by Yoda and Obi-Wan, is that becoming one with the Force after death is a specific skill that has to be learned. It's why Qui-Gon could do it and others couldn't. It's why Ben Solo does at the end of this very film. Mace Windu went out of a window. So did several other Jedi in that chorus who died without ever learning the technique. It's a beautiful moment, and I'd not want it cut. It just isn't allowed. Somewhere in among all that, there's the Holdo maneuver, which isn't really an error so much as a rule the films broke, and then had to live in. At the climax of The Last Jedi, Vice Admiral Holdo turns her cruiser around and jumps to light speed straight through Snoke's flagship, destroying it and a substantial portion of the fleet behind it. It is, visually, the single most striking thing in the trilogy. The silence is extraordinary. I remember the whole cinema making a noise. The problem is what it means for the previous 8 films. If a ship can be used as a light-speed missile, then the Rebel Alliance did not need to steal the Death Star plans, find a thermal exhaust port, or lose most of Red Squadron. They needed one crewed freighter and someone willing. The second Death Star doesn't need a shield generator assault. The Trade Federation blockade doesn't need a 9-year-old. Every siege in the saga has a 2-minute solution that nobody has ever attempted. The Rise of Skywalker does address this sort of, with a line about it being a 1 in a million shot, which is a patch. It's applied in the next film by a different director to close a hole that was opened for a single, beautiful image, and it's the clearest example in the whole franchise of the tension between what makes a great scene and what a shared universe can actually support. I don't think Rian Johnson did anything wrong. For what it's worth, he made the best shot in the trilogy. It's just that, in a story this long, made by this many people, a great shot can cost you a war you already fought 40 years ago, 20 from the sequels. Now the television, which is where the studio's relationship with its own mistakes gets genuinely interesting. Right, last stretch, and I've been looking forward to this one, because it contains my single favourite mistake in the history of the franchise, and it deserves a proper amount of time. The Mandalorian Chapter 12, The Siege, Season 2, Episode 4. Around the 18-minute 50 mark, Din Djarin, Cara Dune and Greef Karga are in a shootout inside an Imperial facility on Navarro. Blaster fire everywhere, stormtroopers, the works, and standing in the background, in shot, in focus, is a man in a plain grey t-shirt and blue jeans, with his hands by his sides, doing absolutely nothing. He is a member of the crew. He got caught behind a set piece when the cameras rolled, decided the safest thing to do was stand very still, and became briefly one of the most famous people on the internet. There are several layers to why I love this. The first is that the episode was directed by Carl Weathers, who is also in the scene. So the director was standing about 10 feet away, in costume, and neither he nor anyone at the monitor spotted a man in modern casual wear in the middle of the frame. The second is that Gene's guy didn't just make the episode, he made the official production stills. Somebody at the studio selected a promotional photograph, looked at it properly, and still sent it out. And the third is what the studio did about it. About a week after fans found him, Disney and Lucasfilm digitally removed him from the episode. He's gone. If you go and watch Chapter 12 tonight, on the platform, he isn't there. Now think about the stormtrooper we started with. In 1997, presented with the most famous mistake in his own film, George Lucas added a comedy sound effect to make it more noticeable. In 2002, he restaged it as a joke with Jango Fett. In 2020, presented with a comparable gift, the studio patched it out inside a week. That's the same company, roughly, 43 years apart, doing the exact opposite thing. The 1977 era is easier to find today than the 2021. Something changed in how this stuff gets treated, and I don't think it's about quality control. I think it's about the fact that a mistake now becomes a global news story in about 4 hours, and a sound effect is no longer a viable response. Anyway, Gene's guy is beloved. There were jokes about action figures. There was genuine mourning when he was removed. He is, in a very real sense, a folk hero. The Book of Boba Fett has a good one, and it's a very old-fashioned sort of error. In 4K in the streets of Mos Espa, you can see wooden planks in the construction of the buildings, ordinary timber in an ordinary construction pattern, on a desert planet that has been repeatedly suggested to have had oceans and rainforests. It's a set. Sets are made of wood. But the resolution went up and the set didn't. That's a genuinely new category of mistake, incidentally. A lot of things that were perfectly safe on a 1980s television are now visible because the picture got 4 times sharper than anything the people making these shows in the 90s could have anticipated. The mistakes didn't change, our eyes did. There's a related timeline problem across the whole Disney-era slate. The Mandalorian's first 2 seasons and the Book of Boba Fett are all placed in the same year, 9 years after Return of the Jedi, and the shows cross over enough that characters have to be in several places in a fairly tight window. Official timeline books have had to do real work to reconcile it, and the fact that they've had to do that work at all is the tell. Obi-Wan Kenobi has a structural problem rather than a visual one, and it's the same problem every prequel has. The ending is fixed. The series is set 9 years before A New Hope. It has Obi-Wan and Vader meet, fight, and speak to each other at length. And then in A New Hope, when they meet on the Death Star, Vader's line is that they meet again at last, that the circle is now complete, and that when he left Obi-Wan, he was but the learner, which reads very differently if they had a full conversation and a duel less than a decade earlier. The show doesn't break the line, it just makes it a much stranger thing to say. The series also has Leia meet Obi-Wan, travel with him, and form a genuine bond, which is fine. Arguably, it strengthens her message in A New Hope, where she calls him her only hope and refers to him serving her father. But it does mean that in Return of the Jedi, when Luke tells her Obi-Wan was his teacher, her reaction is oddly neutral for someone who spent a formative week of her childhood with the man. Andor, I'll say very little about, because it is remarkably tight, and the errors people find are mostly at the level of prop dressing. Which is what happens when a show is shot slowly, with a completed script by people who have time. Ahsoka has a continuity question rather than an error, and it's about Sabine. The show gives her force sensitivity, which is a substantial addition to a character with a long-established history across 2 animated series. It's not a contradiction, exactly. It's a retrofit, and it's the sort of thing that will read as a mistake to some people and as development to others. There's one more from The Mandalorian I want to mention, and it's a design problem rather than an error. The Razor Crest is established as a pre-Empire gunship, old and battered and constantly breaking. It's also, across 2 seasons, repaired from damage that should have written it off several times over. The most obvious case is the Ice Spider episode, where the ship takes structural damage on a level that no amount of Mandalorian ingenuity in a cave should fix, and then flies. That's not a continuity slip so much as a running convenience, and every show with a hero ship has one. The Falcon has had it since 1977, but the Crest's repair schedule is doing an unusual amount of work, and there's a lovely small one from the Book of Boba Fett that isn't about wood. The Speeder Gang. Their vehicles are brightly coloured, chrome, and immaculate, in a city otherwise built entirely out of dust and rust. They look like they've come from a completely different production, which several people pointed out at the time, and which the show never really addresses. It's a design choice rather than a mistake, and it's the sort of design choice that reads as a mistake, because nothing around it agrees. I'd also flag Grogu's timeline, briefly, because it's the largest single continuity question in the current era. He's 50 years old. That's stated in the very first episode, which puts his birth well before the Phantom Menace, means he was at the Jedi Temple during the Purge, and means he was alive and somewhere during the entire prequel trilogy and the whole of the original trilogy. Every additional detail the shows give us about where he was narrows a window that was already quite full, and the material is now doing real work to keep it consistent. And the last one is the broadest, so I'll finish on it. Live-action Star Wars television has now produced more hours of material than the films ever did, made by more people, across more schedules with more shows referring to each other. The wonder isn't that there are continuity errors, The wonder is that there are as few as there are, which is the thing I keep coming back to whenever I make one of these. The original film had a crew of a few hundred people and one director who could, in principle, look at every frame. The current slate has multiple shows shooting simultaneously on multiple continents, with different directors on different episodes of the same season, all of it feeding into a shared continuity that also includes 11 feature films, several animated series, and a library of novels. Nobody can hold all of that in their head. There is no version of a person who has read everything and watched everything and can check a new script against it. There are people whose entire job is to try, and I don't envy them for a second. So the errors change shape. You get fewer crew members in shot because the sets are smaller and the cameras are better supervised. You get more contradictions because there's simply more to contradict. That's the 100. And a fair few more than 100 if you were counting, which I hope you weren't. I want to go back to where we started because it's the bit I keep turning over. 2 men have claimed to be the stormtrooper who walked into that door frame. Laurie Good kept quiet about it for years, then spoke up when Michael Leader started claiming it. Leader died in 2016. Neither of them has ever been able to prove it, and I don't imagine anybody ever will now, which means an accident that lasted about half a second in the summer of 1976 has outlived at least one of the people involved in it, is better documented than most of that day's actual work, and got a sound effect added to it by a man who won an award for something else entirely. Nobody sets out to make one of those. That's the thing. Every single item on this list is somebody having a slightly bad day at work, a tired grip, a rushed pickup, a note that didn't get passed on, and 40 years later, strangers are still talking about it. And a list like this is never really finished. There are new films coming, new remasters, new restorations that quietly fix 3 things and break 2 others, and a resolution jump every few years that makes another handful of old sets look like sets. So I'll probably do more of these. I've got a fair few left over. Sleep well.